The chair screeched across the concrete patio, hurled by a leather-clad arm toward the little girl in the wheelchair. Time seemed to slow as cafe patrons watched in horror, their morning coffees forgotten in their hands. The German shepherd moved like liquid lightning, positioning his muscular body between the flying furniture and the paralyzed child, his teeth bared in a silent warning that made even grown men step back. The biker, Derek, stood with his feet planted wide, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth that didn't quite reach his eyes that held something darker, something broken. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent patio. "It's just a joke." But as the massive dog's growl rumbled like distant thunder, no one was laughing. And no one, least of all Derek, realized that in that moment, 3 lives connected by tragedy were about to collide in ways that would change them forever. The service vest on the dog's back told a story Derek couldn't yet read, and the little girl's clear blue eyes held no fear, only a puzzling recognition, but as if she'd been waiting for him all along. Remember to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Sophie Anderson had once been a whirlwind of energy, the kind of child who'd never walk when she could run, never speak when she could sing. That was before the rainy Tuesday evening when a drunk driver swerved across the center line on Highway 16, taking her parents' lives and her ability to walk in one catastrophic moment. At 6 years old, Sophie now navigated the world from a pediatric wheelchair, her small hands already calloused from pushing the wheels, her golden hair often twisted into practical braids by her Aunt Martha. But what Sophie had lost in mobility, she gained in perspective. The nurses at Glendale Memorial often whispered that she had old eyes too, knowing, too accepting for a child who'd suffered such profound loss. Still, flashes of childish joy would break through when Thor, her German shepherd service dog, was nearby. He'd been her father's last gift to her, arranged before his death through connections at the K9 unit where James Anderson had served as a police officer. Thor's background made him uniquely qualified for his role in Sophie's life. Before becoming her service dog, he'd served 3 distinguished years in the Glendale Police Department's K9 unit, specializing in search and rescue operations. His training had been so exemplary that he'd received special commendation when he'd located 2 children trapped beneath rubble after a gas explosion. Thor's transition to service work had been seamless, trading the intensity of police work for the constant vigilance required to assist Sophie. The specialized harness he wore allowed Sophie to steady herself during transfers, while his imposing presence deterred the unwanted attention her wheelchair sometimes attracted. Thor was more than Sophie's assistant. He was her guardian, confidant, and bridge to independence. Derek Mitchell hadn't always been the kind of man who'd intimidate a child. Before his 3 tours in Afghanistan, he'd been known for his easy laugh and steady hands that had trained military dogs with patience few handlers possessed. But war had hollowed him out, replacing calm confidence with jagged anxiety and unpredictable rage. The memories haunted him. The explosion, the frantic barking of his K9 partner trying to alert him, the sacrifice of his best friend James who'd pushed him clear of the blast. Derek's return to civilian life had been a series of failures. Jobs lost to sudden angry outbursts, relationships fractured by his nightmares, self-medication with whatever would quiet his mind. The leather jacket and motorcycle had become his armor against a world that no longer made sense, the rumble of the engine drowning out the persistent ringing in his ears. The morning had dawned picture-perfect over Glendale, with the kind of clear blue sky that seemed to promise nothing but good things. At Rosewood Cafe, the outdoor patio had filled early, with the usual mix of professionals grabbing coffee before work, retirees lingering over breakfast, and locals who treated the cafe as their second office. The corner table, slightly removed from the busiest section, had become something of an unofficial reservation for Sophie and her Aunt Martha. The staff had grown accustomed to the little girl's wheelchair needing extra space, and the manager, Elaine, though always made sure the table was available for their Tuesday morning visits. Sophie sat with her back straight in her wheelchair, her legs covered with a light blanket despite the warmth of the day, a concession to circulation issues that Martha insisted upon. Thor lay in a perfect downstay position beside her, his alert eyes continuously scanning the patio with professional vigilance. On the table sat Sophie's chocolate milk, Martha's black coffee, and a shared plate of blueberry scones that Sophie methodically broke into bite-sized pieces. "Remember your exercises this afternoon?" Martha was saying, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the day's schedule in her worn planner. "Weston says you're making excellent progress with your upper body strength." Sophie nodded, though her attention had drifted to a monarch butterfly landing briefly on a nearby flowering bush. "Aunt Martha, do butterflies remember being caterpillars?" she asked, her question reflecting the characteristic way her mind wandered between practical matters and philosophical wonderings. Martha smiled, accustomed to these sudden shifts. "That's a good question for your science teacher, sweetheart." She checked her watch and frowned slightly. "I need to stop by the pharmacy before your appointment. Your new medication came in yesterday." Sophie's face fell slightly. The new medication was supposed to help with the pain that sometimes shot through her legs, phantom sensations, from nerves that refused to accept they no longer commanded movement. "Can't we skip it today? I don't like how it makes my head fuzzy." "We'll talk to Dr. Weston about adjusting the dose," Martha promised, gathering her purse. "I'll be back in 15 minutes, 20 at most. Elaine knows I'm stepping out and Thor is right here." She hesitated, her caregiver's instinct warring with the knowledge that Sophie needed moments of independence. "You'll be okay?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "Thor and I will be fine. We'll practice our waiting skills." She patted the dog's head, and his tail thumped once against the concrete in acknowledgement. Martha leaned down to kiss Sophie's forehead, her hand automatically checking that the medical alert button was secure around Sophie's neck. "I'll be quick as lightning." As Martha's sensible shoes clicked away across the patio, Sophie turned her attention to her chocolate milk and used both hands to steady the plastic cup as she'd been taught in occupational therapy. Thor remained vigilant beside her, his body relaxed but ready. Several patrons nodded or smiled at Sophie. She had become something of a fixture at the cafe, her quiet dignity and occasional bright laughter a reminder of resilience that many found inspiring. The peaceful morning rhythm continued for another 10 minutes. Sophie had just opened her favourite book, a dog-eared copy of Charlotte's Web that had belonged to her mother when the distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines disrupted the cafe's ambient chatter. 3 bikes pulled up to the curb just beyond the patio's decorative iron fence, their engines cutting off in quick succession. The riders dismounted with the practiced ease of men who lived on their machines. The leader, taller than the others and broad through the shoulders, removed his helmet to reveal close-cropped hair with premature grey at the temples. The leather vest he wore over a faded T-shirt bore no motorcycle club insignia, but the military boots and the way he surveyed his surroundings spoke of someone accustomed to assessing threats. Thor's ears pricked forward, his body tensing slightly, though he maintained his downstay. Sophie noticed the change immediately. She and Thor had developed the kind of wordless communication that comes from constant companionship. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, though something in the air had changed, a tension that even her young mind could perceive. The 3 men entered the patio area, the leader walking slightly ahead with a rolling gait. A server approached them with meanness, but the leader, Derek, waved her off with a brusque "just coffee." Black, boy, bass. His voice carried across the patio, slightly too loud, as if he'd forgotten how to modulate it for civilian spaces. As the men settled at a table near the entrance, their presence seemed to expand beyond their physical space. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter, more guarded. Derek's restless gaze swept across the patio, briefly settling on Sophie and Thor before moving on. But seconds later his eyes snapped back, focusing more intently on the German shepherd. "That's a nice-looking dog," he commented to his companions, though his voice projected enough for Sophie to hear. The youngest of the three men, who'd introduced himself to the server as Mac, shrugged. "Just some kid's pet." Derek's laugh held an edge. "That's no pet. Look at how he's positioned, how he's watching everything." He tapped his fingers on the table in a staccato rhythm. "Military trained, I'd bet money on it." Sophie, overhearing this, felt a small flush of pride. People often complimented Thor, but few recognized the extent of his training. She glanced at the cafe entrance, hoping to see Aunt Martha returning, but the doorway remained empty. The server delivered 3 mugs of coffee to the men's table. As she walked away, Derek rose suddenly, causing Thor to shift to high alert, though the dog remained in position. "I'm going to check out that dog," Derek announced, ignoring the way his friends rolled their eyes. "Leave it, Mitchell," the third man said. "Just drink your coffee." But Derek was already moving across the patio with deliberate steps. Several patrons watched warily, unsure of his intentions. As he approached Sophie's table, Thor's body tensed further, though no sound came from him. Sophie looked up at the tall man, now standing beside her table, her small face composed despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Good morning, sir," she said politely, as Martha had taught her to address adults. Derek seemed momentarily taken aback by her formality. "Good morning, kid." His eyes remained on Thor. "That's some dog you've got there. German shepherd, purebred from the look of him." "Yes, sir, his name is Thor," Sophie replied, her hand instinctively moving to rest on Thor's head, both for her comfort and as a steadying command to the dog. "Thor, huh?" Derek squatted down to the dog's eye level, a move that made Thor's ears flatten slightly. "You're a working dog, aren't you, boy?" He reached out a hand toward Thor's snout. "Please don't touch him without asking," Sophie said quickly. "He's on duty." "Why?" Derek's hand paused in mid-air. "On duty?" His eyes took in the service vest he'd somehow missed before, then travelled to Sophie's wheelchair, understanding dawning slowly on his face. "Oh, right." But instead of withdrawing, he left his hand extended inches from Thor's nose. "I've handled dogs like him before. They know me." From across the patio, one of Derek's friends called out, "Come on, man, leave the kid alone!" But Derek seemed transfixed by Thor, by the dog's controlled alertness and the intelligent assessment in his eyes. Something about the animal had triggered a cascade of memories of desert sand and night patrols, of the comforting weight of a canine partner against his side in the darkness. "Ex-military?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Sophie shook her head. "Police. He worked with my daddy." At the word daddy, a shadow crossed Derek's face, a tightening around his eyes that Sophie couldn't interpret. The cafe had grown unusually quiet, the other patrons sensing the strange tension building between the man, the child, and the dog that watched him with unwavering attention. Thor remained perfectly still, but Sophie could feel the coiled readiness in his body, the slight tremor of restraint beneath her small hand. She glanced again toward the cafe entrance, hoping for Aunt Martha's return. The big clock on the cafe wall showed that 12 minutes had passed, not long in adult time, but an eternity in the stretch moment of uncomfortable encounter. "Your daddy a cop, then?" Derek asked, his voice rougher. "He was," Sophie said simply, the past tense heavy with meaning. Something flickered in Derek's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of memory. He straightened up, suddenly looming over the table. Good dog, you've got, he repeated, though the words seemed automatic now. He took a step back, then another, before turning abruptly to rejoin his friends. As he walked away, Sophie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thor remained vigilant, his eyes tracking Derek's movement across the patio. The normal murmur of cafe conversation slowly resumed, though several patrons continued to cast concerned glances towards Sophie's table. But the encounter wasn't over. As Derek settled back with his friends, their conversation grew animated, punctuated by occasional laughter that seemed too loud, too forced. Sophie tried to return to her book, but found herself reading the same sentence repeatedly, her attention divided between the page and the uncomfortable awareness of being watched. Thor knew it too. His body remained tense, his attention fixed on the three men whose presence had disrupted the peaceful morning routine. And somehow, Sophie sensed with a child's intuition that the seemingly casual encounter had been merely the opening move in a confrontation yet to fully unfold. Derek returned to his friends with a strange expression, something between intrigue and discomfort etched across his weathered features. He took a long swig of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. "That dog's got police training," he muttered, loud enough for his companions to hear, but keeping his voice low enough to avoid carrying across the patio. Not just any service dog. Mac, the youngest of the three with a patchy beard that failed to hide his youth, glanced over at Sophie's table. "So what? You going to start a fan club?" His attempt at humor fell flat as Derek's expression darkened. "I work with dogs like that," Derek said, his fingers drumming against the table in that persistent rhythm that always appeared when his thoughts turned toward his time in service. Belgium, Illinois, and Afghanistan, but same training principles. That dog's watching me like he knows something. The third man, Cal, a former army mechanic who'd served alongside Derek in their second tour, shook his head. "It's just a dog, Mitchell, and you're making the kid uncomfortable. Let it go." But Derek couldn't let it go. Something about the German Shepherd had triggered a flood of memories that disciplined alert posture, the intelligent assessment in the animal's eyes. Those eyes had followed him across the patio, watchful in a way that reminded him too much of Axel, his canine partner who'd saved his unit twice before the AE that no dog could have detected in time. Derek rose again, ignoring Cal's muttered curse. "I'm just going to see what he does." He moved with deliberate steps back towards Sophie's table, aware that several patrons were watching him with undisguised concern. The weight of their gazes prickled along his skin, triggering the hypervigilance that never fully subsided. Thor's reaction was immediate, but controlled. The dog shifted position, rising into a perfect sit beside Sophie's wheelchair, his body now squarely between the approaching man and the child. No growl, no bark, just a precise professional repositioning that spoke volumes about his training. "See that?" Derek said loudly enough that his friends could hear. "That's defensive positioning, perfect execution." He stopped about 5 feet from the table, respecting the invisible boundary that Thor had established. "Your dog ever been deployed overseas, kid?" Sophie shook her head, her small fingers now resting lightly on Thor's shoulder. "No, sir." Thor worked for the Glendale Police Department in search and rescue. Her voice remained steady, polite, though wariness had crept into her blue eyes. Derek cocked his head, studying Thor with an intensity that made several nearby patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Search and rescue, huh? Found any good missing persons lately?" His tone had shifted, taking on a challenging edge. "He's retired now," Sophie replied, "except for helping me." She gestured toward her wheelchair, a simple movement that carried the weight of explanation. Derek's eyes lingered on the wheelchair, then moved back to Thor. "Let's see how good his training really is." Without warning, he clapped his hands sharply, the sound cracking across the patio like a gunshot. Coffee cups rattled as startled patrons jumped, a woman at the next table gasping audibly. But Thor didn't flinch, didn't bark. His ears flattened momentarily, his muscles tensed, but he remained in perfect position, his eyes locked on Derek with unwavering focus. "Derek, enough," Cal called from their table, half rising from his chair. "Leave the kid and her dog alone." But Derek had found a target for the restless energy that constantly churned inside him, the need to provoke a reaction, to test boundaries until they broke. "Good boy," he said to Thor, his voice holding a mocking edge, real steady. "But what happens if I do this?" He took a sudden step towards Sophie. Thor's response was immediate, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated from deep in his chest, a warning as clear as spoken language. The dog didn't move from his position, didn't show teeth, but the message was unmistakable. "Stop it," Sophie said, her voice smaller now but still composed. "You're scaring everyone." Derek glanced around, suddenly aware of the tension that had spread across the patio. Several patrons had pulled out their phones, some openly filming, others with fingers poised over emergency contacts. The server who'd brought their coffee stood frozen near the entrance, looking uncertainly toward the manager's office. For a moment, something like shame flickered across Derek's face. He took a step back, raising his hand slightly. "Just testing his training," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. No harm meant. "Thor is very well trained," Sophie said, her hand still resting on the dog's shoulder. "My daddy made sure of that before he went to heaven." Her composure wavered slightly on the last words, a child's grief momentarily visible beneath her careful poise. Something in Derek's expression shifted at the mention of Sophie's father. A muscle twitched in his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "Your dad taught him well," he said, his voice rougher. He turned abruptly, stalking back to his companions with rigid shoulders. "Happy now?" Cal asked as Derek dropped heavily into his chair. "You just harassed a disabled kid. Real heroic, Mitchell." Mac laughed nervously. The dog didn't even flinch, military grade for sure. Derek's gaze remained fixed on Sophie and Thor, something troubled and distant in his eyes. "That kid said her dad's dead." Cal shrugged. "Lots of cops die in the line of duty. Doesn't make it your business." "Something about them," Derek trailed off, his thoughts whirling in directions he couldn't fully articulate. The coffee in his mug had grown cold, but he drank it anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. The ringing in his ears had intensified, a constant companion since the explosion, but worse now with the adrenaline coursing through his system. Across the patio, Sophie had returned to her book, or at least was making a show of reading it. Thor remained vigilant, his attention divided between his charge and the three men whose presence had disrupted their morning routine. "We should go," Cal said, checking his watch. "Got that appointment at the VA at 11. But Derek wasn't ready to leave. Something unfinished pulled at him, a compulsion he couldn't name. He watched as Sophie turned a page in her book, her movements careful and precise. There was something about her that nagged at his memory, something he couldn't quite place. "One more test," he said suddenly, pushing his chair back. Cal grabbed his arm. "Derek, no, we're leaving, now." Derek shook him off with a sharp movement. "Just one more. I need to see something." He strode across the patio before his friends could stop him, ignoring the murmurs that followed his approach. Thor was on his feet the moment Derek moved, once again positioning himself between the approaching man and Sophie. This time the dog's hackles were slightly raised, his stance wider and more defensive. "Sir, please go back to your table," Sophie said, her voice steadied despite the tension evident in her small frame. "Thor doesn't like people approaching fast." Derek stopped, but closer this time, just beyond arm's reach. "Smart dog," he said, his eyes fixed on Thor rather than Sophie. "Knows when someone's a threat." He shifted his weight slightly, a testing movement. Thor's growl deepened, the sound carrying across the now silent patio. Several patrons stood, unsure whether to intervene, while others moved further away from the developing confrontation. "I'm not a threat," Derek said, though his body language communicated otherwise. "He is curious about how good he really is." Without warning, he reached towards Sophie's book. Thor's reaction was immediate and calculated. He moved forward just enough to block Derek's hand, teeth still concealed, but stance now unmistakably protective. The growl hadn't stopped, a continuous warning that made the hair on the back of Derek's neck stand up. "See?" Derek said, pulling his hand back. "A perfect threat assessment. Your dad trained him to protect you specifically, didn't he?" Sophie nodded slowly. "Thor keeps me safe." Her voice trembled slightly now, the first real indication that the confrontation had begun to pierce her carefully maintained composure. From across the patio, Mac called out, "Come on, Derek! Let it go, man!" Man. But Derek was locked in now, a confrontation of wills with the German shepherd, whose disciplined response both impressed and provoked him. "Let's see what happens if I do this," he said, and before anyone could react, he moved to touch Sophie's wheelchair. Thor's warning growl escalated instantly into a sharp, authoritative bark that froze Derek in his tracks. The dog still hadn't moved from his defensive position, hadn't attempted to bite, but the message was clear. This was the final warning. A woman at a nearby table stood up forcefully, her chair scraping against the concrete. "That's enough," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. "Leave that child alone right now." Derek turned towards the woman, irritation flashing across his face. "Mind your own business, lady. I'm not hurting anyone." "You're harassing a disabled child," the woman replied, stepping forward. "And I've already called the manager." As if on cue, the cafe manager emerged from inside, a middle-aged woman with a determined expression. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, though her eyes made it clear she already knew the answer. Derek stepped back from Sophie's table, his hands raising slightly in a gesture that was half surrender, half dismissal. No problem, just admiring the dog's training. He was scaring Sophie. Another patron interjected, "Been at it since his friend left." The manager's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you and your friends to leave. We don't tolerate harassment of any kind at Rosewood." Derek's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. "Harassment? I was just talking to the kid." "You were testing my dog," Sophie said quietly, and making him nervous. "Please stop." Her simple request, delivered without accusation but with undeniable clarity, seemed to land differently than the manager's demand. Derek looked at Sophie, really looked at her for the first time, and for a brief moment, something like recognition flickered in his eyes. "Fine," he said abruptly. "We're going." He turned and strode back to his companions, who were already standing, clearly eager to leave the tense situation. As they collected their helmets, Mac muttered, "What the hell was that about, Mitchell?" Derek didn't answer. His gaze had returned to Sophie and Thor, a troubled frown creasing his forehead. As the three men made their way out of the patio area, several patrons visibly relaxed, the collective tension beginning to dissipate. But just as they reached the exit, Derek paused, turning back to look at Sophie one more time. "Hey, kid," he called across the patio, "what's your last name?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and somehow ominous. Sophie hesitated, years of stranger danger warnings warring with her inherent politeness. "That's not appropriate," the manager stated firmly. "Please leave now." Derek stood motionless for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and followed his friends out of the cafe, the rumble of motorcycle engines soon signaling their departure. In the aftermath of their exit, the patio remained unusually quiet. Several patrons approached Sophie's table, offering reassuring words and concerned questions about her well-being. Thor gradually relaxed his defensive posture, though his attention remained focused on the cafe entrance as if expecting Derek's return. And Sophie, her book forgotten in her lap, sat watching the empty doorway with a thoughtful expression that seemed too old for her young face. Something had shifted in the morning's peaceful routine, a confrontation that felt unfinished, a connection not yet fully revealed. As Thor settled back beside her wheelchair, his warm presence reassuring against her leg, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the strange man with the troubled eyes would return. The patio of Rosewood Cafe had barely settled back into its normal rhythm when the distinctive sound of Martha's sensible heels clicked across the concrete. She hurried toward Sophie's table, a small white pharmacy bag clutched in one hand, her normally composed expression creased with concern. Several patrons watched her approach, exchanging meaningful glances. The Guardian had returned, but too late to prevent the unsettling confrontation. "I'm so sorry I took longer than expected," Martha said, slightly breathless, as she placed the medication bag on the table. The pharmacist needed to review the dosage instructions she stopped mid-sentence, registering the unusual atmosphere in Thor's still alert posture. "What happened? Is everything all right?" Before Sophie could answer, the cafe manager approached, coffee pot in hand, but clearly using it as an excuse to check on the situation. "There was a bit of an incident," she explained in a low voice to Martha. "3 men on motorcycles came in, and one of them took an unusual interest in Sophie's dog. He became somewhat aggressive in testing the dog's responses. We asked them to leave." Martha's face paled, her hand instinctively reaching for Sophie's shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetheart? Did that man frighten you?" Sophie shook her head slightly, though the small furrow between her brows belied her calm answer. "I'm sure Thor protected me. He didn't let the man get too close." She hesitated, then added with childish honesty, "But it was scary when he got loud." The manager refilled Martha's coffee cup, her movements deliberate, as she added, "Several customers were concerned enough to record the interaction on their phones. We have their contact information if you want to follow up." Martha's expression tightened, the protective fierceness that had become her default since taking guardianship of Sophie emerging fully. "I would appreciate those contacts, and I'd like to know if those men are regular customers." "First time I've seen them," the manager replied. "And hopefully the last, given their behavior." She offered a reassuring smile to Sophie before moving to attend to other tables. Martha sat down heavily in her chair, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee. The constant vigilance required to protect a vulnerable child in a world that sometimes seemed designed for the able-bodied and strong had worn her down over the past year, etching new lines around her eyes and mouth. "Maybe we should go straight to your appointment," she suggested, though Sophie had barely touched her scone. "Can we stay?" Sophie asked, her small voice steady for her needs to settle after being on alert. "Dr. Harrison says it's important for his training that he can return to normal after a stressful situation." Martha hesitated, torn between the desire to remove Sophie from a place where she'd been harassed and the importance of maintaining routines. "All right," she conceded, "but we'll leave in 20 minutes. As they sat in uneasy calm, several patrons stopped by their table, some to express concern, others to praise Thor's composed behavior, and a few to share their own stories of service dogs that had proven invaluable companions. The retired gentleman who introduced himself as a former canine handler particularly commended Thor's restraint. "That's professional-grade training," he observed, nodding appreciatively toward the German Shepherd, who had finally relaxed into a downstay position. "Most dogs would have escalated much faster with that kind of provocation. Your dog kept a perfect threat assessment without overreacting." Sophie nodded, a small flicker of pride breaking through her lingering unease. "My daddy said Thor was the best in his class. That's why he chose him for me." The man smiled kindly. "Your daddy chose well." When they finally left the cafe, Martha was hyper-aware of their surroundings, scanning the street and parking lot with nervous attention. The white pharmacy bag with Sophie's medication was tucked into the backpack hanging from her wheelchair, and Thor walked perfectly positioned on Sophie's left side, making his training once again impeccable now that the perceived threat had passed. The remainder of the day proceeded with the structured routine that had become essential to Sophie's recovery and ongoing care physical therapy at the rehabilitation centre, then a brief session with the child psychologist who had been helping her process her grief, and finally, a stop at the park where Thor was allowed some off-duty time to run in the enclosed dog area. But throughout these familiar activities, Martha could sense a lingering tension in both Sophie and Thor. The child was quieter than usual, her normally inquisitive mind seemingly turned inward on thoughts she didn't share. And Thor, though responding perfectly to all commands, maintained a heightened awareness that the other service dog handlers at the rehabilitation centre noticed immediately. "A rough day?" asked Ellie, whose golden retriever service dog assisted with her multiple sclerosis. She and Martha often exchanged the knowing glances of those navigating disability challenges while Sophie worked with her therapists. Some motorcycle enthusiasts decided to test Thor's training at the cafe this morning, Martha replied, keeping her voice low. Apparently he found it amusing to see how a service dog would react to increasingly threatening behavior. Ellie's expression darkened, unfortunately not uncommon. Some people can't seem to understand that service dogs are working, not performing. She hesitated, then added, "Was Sophie frightened?" Martha watched through the glass partition as Sophie worked on strengthening exercises, her physical therapist offering encouragement as she used adapted equipment. She says she wasn't, but she trailed off, the worry she'd been suppressing all day rising to the surface. It's hard to tell with Sophie sometimes. Since the accident, she's become so contained. The psychologist says it's a control mechanism. When you've lost so much control over your body and circumstances, you tightly manage what you can, including emotional expression. Ellie nodded in understanding. Self-protection takes many forms. That evening, as Martha helped Sophie with her bedtime routine, the careful transfers from wheelchair to bathroom to bed that had become second nature over the past year, she noticed that Sophie seemed lost in thought, responding to questions with uncharacteristic brevity. "Are you thinking about what happened at the cafe today?" Martha finally asked directly as she helped Sophie into her pajamas. The nightly ritual of managing leg braces and catheter care requiring both physical assistance and delicate preservation of a growing child's dignity. Sophie nodded, her fingers absently stroking Thor, who lay beside the bed, always within reach. "He wasn't a bad man," she said after a long moment. "The one who was testing Thor." Martha's hand stilled in the act of arranging Sophie's pillows. "He behaved very inappropriately, Sophie. Good people don't frighten children or harass service dogs." "He had sad eyes," Sophie continued, as if Martha hadn't spoken, like in the pictures of Daddy when he came back from overseas the first time, before he got better. The observation struck Martha with unexpected force. James had indeed struggled after his first deployment, the haunted look in his eyes, the startling response to loud noises, the nights when sleep proved elusive. But he'd sought help, had worked through the worst of it before returning for his second tour, before meeting and falling in love with Sophie's mother, before creating the family that had been shattered on that rainy highway. "Some people have seen difficult things," Martha acknowledged carefully, "but that doesn't excuse frightening behavior." "Thor knew he was sad, too," Sophie said, with the certainty children sometimes possess. "That's why he didn't bite him." "Thor only bites bad people, not sad people." Martha had no response to this childish wisdom. Instead, she finished tucking Sophie in, made sure her medication and water were within reach on the bedside table, and ensured the monitor was turned on so Sophie could call her during the night if needed. "Sleep well, sweetheart," she said, kissing Sophie's forehead. Thor is right here and I'm just down the hall. As she turned out the light, leaving only the small nightlight glowing in the corner, Martha heard Sophie's small voice once more. I think he's going to come back. The words sent a chill down Martha's spine, but when she turned to ask what Sophie meant, the child had already closed her eyes, her breathing beginning to deepen towards sleep. Martha stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the gentle rise and fall of Sophie's chest, the faithful shadow of Thor beside the bed. The day's events had left her uneasy in a way she couldn't fully articulate, not just the confrontation itself, but Sophie's peculiar reaction to it. For a child who had endured so much trauma, Sophie displayed an uncanny ability to read people, to sense the pain beneath hostile behavior. Jane's had been the same way, Martha remembered. Her brother had possessed an intuitive understanding of people's motivations, particularly those in pain. It had made him an exceptional police officer, well suited to community policing and crisis intervention. Had he passed that gift to his daughter, or was it simply that those who suffered deeply develop a sharper awareness of suffering in others? The following morning brought an unexpected development. As Martha prepared breakfast, carefully cutting Sophie's toast into manageable pieces and measuring out her morning medications, the house phone rang. Few people called the landline. Martha had maintained it primarily for emergency purposes, concerned that cell service might be unreliable in a crisis. Anderson residence, she answered, balancing the phone between shoulder and ear as she continued preparing Sophie's breakfast tray. Mrs. Anderson? The voice was male, professionally neutral. This is Officer Daniels from the Glendale Police Department. I'm calling about an incident report filed yesterday by the manager of Rosewood Cafe. Martha's hand stilled. Yes, I'm aware of the incident. My niece was the child involved. We'd like you and your niece to come to the station to give a statement, the officer continued. We take harassment of disabled individuals very seriously, and several witnesses provided us with video evidence of the encounter. I see, Martha said, glancing toward the hallway where Sophie was still sleeping. May I ask what prompted this follow-up? Did those men cause problems elsewhere? There was a slight hesitation on the line. One of the individuals involved in the incident came to the station late yesterday evening. He appeared disturbed by his own behavior and provided information that suggests this wasn't a random incident given the circumstances and the department's connection to your family. Captain Brooks would like to speak with you directly. Martha's grip tightened on the phone. Connection to my family? Your brother was James Anderson, correct? One of our officers who passed away last year. Yes, Martha confirmed, a creeping unease spreading through her chest. What does James have to do with what happened at the cafe? I believe Captain Brooks would prefer to discuss that in person, Officer Daniels replied. Would 10 o'clock this morning be convenient? We'll make sure the interview room is wheelchair accessible for your niece. After confirming the appointment and ending the call, Martha stood motionless in the kitchen, breakfast preparations forgotten. The police department wanted to talk to him about James's connection to the incident, and one of the men, presumably the one who had harassed Sophie and Thor, had turned himself in, apparently troubled by his own actions. Aunt Martha, Sophie's voice called from her bedroom, Thor needs to go outside. The familiar routine of the morning reasserted itself, helping Sophie with toileting and dressing, the careful morning stretches prescribed by her physical therapist, Thor's brief outdoor break, supervised by Martha while Sophie did her exercises in bed. But beneath the structured normalcy, Martha's mind raced with questions. What connection could possibly exist between her late brother and the aggressive stranger at the cafe? As she helped Sophie into her wheelchair, making sure her legs were properly positioned and the safety belt secured, Martha debated how much to tell her about the police department's call. Sophie had been through so much, the last thing she needed was more uncertainty or stress. But she was also remarkably perceptive, often sensing when adults were withholding information. We need to go to the police station this morning, Martha finally said as she placed Sophie's breakfast tray across her wheelchair arms. The police want to talk to us about what happened at the cafe yesterday. Sophie nodded, seemingly unsurprised. Because of the man who was testing Thor? Yes, Martha confirmed, watching Sophie's face carefully. The police said one of the men went to the station last night. He was upset about how he behaved. A small frown creased Sophie's forehead.
The sad one? With the loud voice? I believe so, Martha said, struck again by Sophie's characterization of the man as sad rather than scary or mean. The descriptions one might expect from a child who had been harassed. Sophie was quiet for a moment, methodically cutting her toast into even smaller pieces than Martha had prepared. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but clear.
Is it because he knew my daddy?
The question landed like a physical shock, stopping Martha in her tracks as she was pouring orange juice. She set the picture down carefully, turning to face Sophie fully. Why would you think that? Sophie shrugged, a small movement limited by her decreased upper body strength. The way he looked at Thor, and he asked me my last name before they left. I think he recognized Thor from somewhere. Martha kneeled beside the wheelchair, bringing herself to eye level with Sophie. Sweetheart, did that man say something to you about your father? Something I didn't hear? Sophie shook her head. No, but his eyes changed when I said Thor worked with Daddy, and when I said Daddy was in heaven. She took a small bite of toast, chewing thoughtfully before adding, I think he's the one who's coming back. The Glendale Police Department building stood as a monument to practical municipal architecture, all straight lines and functional design, softened only by the American flag that fluttered above the entrance. Martha guided Sophie's wheelchair up the gently sloping ramp, Thor walking in perfect heel position beside them. Despite having visited many times when James was alive, Martha felt a flutter of anxiety as they approached the glass doors. This wasn't a social call or a family visit. This was about yesterday's disturbing encounter. Officer Daniels met them in the lobby, a stocky man with a closely trimmed beard and kind eyes that crinkled when he knelt to greet Sophie at eye level. You must be Sophie, he said warmly. I knew your dad. He talked about you all the time. Sophie nodded solemnly. This is Thor, she said, gesturing to the German shepherd who remained in perfect position despite the distractions of the busy station. I know Thor too, Officer Daniels replied with a respectful nod toward the dog. Best search and rescue dog we ever had. He straightened, addressing Martha. Captain Brooks is waiting for you in the community room. We thought it would be more comfortable than an interview room. Martha appreciated the consideration. Standard interview rooms were hardly designed for accessibility or comfort. She followed Officer Daniels through the security checkpoint, where Thor was acknowledged with professional courtesy by the canine officers on duty, their police dogs maintaining disciplined postures even as their eyes tracked their former colleague. The community room was located on the first floor, a large space used for public meetings and departmental gatherings. As Officer Daniels opened the door, Martha's steps faltered. Seated at the table across from Captain Brooks was a familiar figure, the man from the cafe, still in his leather jacket, but looking markedly different from the aggressive presence that had disturbed their morning routine. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped tightly on the table before him, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet Martha's startled gaze, were bloodshot and wary. Mrs. Anderson. Sophie, Captain Brooks said, rising from his seat. Thank you for coming in. I believe you've encountered Mr. Mitchell before, though under unfortunate circumstances. Derek Mitchell stood awkwardly, his posture stiff with apparent discomfort. I am, he said with a slight nod toward Martha, his voice rougher and quieter than she remembered from the cafe. His gaze shifted to Sophie, then immediately to Thor, whose ears had perked forward in recognition. Martha instinctively moved to position herself between Derek and Sophie's wheelchair. Captain, I wasn't aware this would be a confrontation. I don't think Sophie needs to. It's not a confrontation, Captain Brooks interrupted gently. Mr. Mitchell came to us voluntarily last night. There are some circumstances you should be aware of. He gestured toward the chairs arranged around the table. Please have a seat. Mr. Mitchell has something important to tell you. Sophie, who had been watching the exchange with keen attention, suddenly spoke up.
You served with my daddy, didn't you? The directness of her question silenced the room. Thor, sensing something significant, moved closer to her wheelchair, his body maintaining the alert but non-threatening posture of a service dog, anticipating his handler's needs. Derek's eyes widened, his gaze truly fixing on Sophie's face for the first time. How did you know that? Sophie shrugged slightly, a child's gesture at odds with the perceptiveness of her question. You have the same tattoo as Daddy on your arm, the eagle with the flag, and you knew Thor was special, not just a regular dog. Martha looked sharply at Derek's forearm, where indeed the edge of a tattoo was visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve, the distinctive insignia of the specialized unit James had served with during his military service before joining him, the police force. A chill ran through her as the pieces began to connect. You better sit down, Martha, Captain Brooks said quietly. This is going to be a difficult conversation. Reluctantly, Martha guided Sophie's wheelchair to the table, positioning her niece safely between herself and Officer Daniels. Thor settled in his designated spot beside Sophie, his attention now divided between his handler and Derek, who had remained standing, seemingly unable to return to his seat. James Anderson was my best friend, Derek finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. We served 2 tours together. He saved my life in Kandahar when our unit was ambushed. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I was with him when he found Thor as a half-starved stray near our compound. We trained him together, unofficially at first. Martha's breath caught in her throat. James had told her stories about finding a German shepherd puppy, about the bond that had formed between them during his deployment. But he'd never mentioned a friend named Derek. When we got back stateside, Derek continued, James got Thor officially recognized and certified for police work. I went back for a 3rd tour. That's when his voice cracked and he looked away, his jaw working as he struggled to maintain composure. Captain Brooks picked up the narrative. Derek was injured during his 3rd deployment. By the time he returned to the States, James had joined our department and established our K9 unit with Thor as his partner. Martha's mind was reeling as she tried to process this new information. James never mentioned you, she said to Derek, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. After a flash of pain crossed Derek's face, we lost touch. After my injury, I wasn't in a good place. Didn't want to drag anyone down with me. His eyes shifted to Sophie, then quickly away, as if he couldn't bear to look at her directly. By the time I got my head together enough to reach out, I heard about the accident, about James and Laura. His voice dropped even lower, about Sophie. May. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The man who had harassed him at the cafe, who had deliberately provoked Thor and frightened Sophie, but was someone from James's past, someone who might have been an uncle to Sophie in another lifetime if circumstances had been different. Why did you approach us like that? Martha demanded, her protective instincts flaring. If you knew who Sophie was, why would you behave so aggressively? Derek shook his head, a gesture of self-disgust rather than denial. I didn't know, not at first. I recognized Thor immediately. A handler never forgets a dog he's worked with. But it had been years, and I'd never met Sophie. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. When she mentioned her dad was a police officer who had passed away, something clicked. But I wasn't thinking clearly. I haven't been thinking clearly for a long time. Captain Brooks leaned forward, his expression grave but compassionate. Derek has been struggling with severe PTSD since his discharge. He's been in and out of treatment, but the past few months have been particularly difficult for him. That doesn't excuse what happened, Martha said firmly.
No, it doesn't, Derek agreed immediately. There's no excuse. That's why I came in last night. When I got home, when the fog cleared a bit, I realized who Sophie must be. James's daughter. His voice broke on the name. I couldn't live with myself knowing what I'd done. What I might have done if it had escalated further. Sophie, who had been watching this exchange with solemn attention, suddenly spoke again.
Did you train Thor too?
Before Daddy?
Derek looked startled by the question, his gaze finally meeting Sophie's directly.
Yes, he admitted. Your dad and I both worked with him when he was young. That's why he didn't attack me yesterday, even when I was being inappropriate. He remembered me on some level. Thor remembers everyone who's kind to him, Sophie said, with the simple certainty of a child. That's what Daddy always said.
The conversation might have continued in this vain, painful revelation, tempered by Sophie's innocent observations, if not for the sudden commotion that erupted in the hallway outside, raised voices, the sound of hurried footsteps, and then the community room door burst open to reveal Mac, the youngest of Derek's companions from the cafe, and his face flushed and his expression frantic. "Mitchell, we've been looking everywhere for you," he exclaimed, seemingly oblivious to the formal setting or the presence of police officers. "Cal's in trouble, man. That guy from the bar last night, the one who was hassling you about Afghanistan, he followed Cal home, and now he's threatening to." He broke off, finally registering the others in the room, his eyes widening as he recognized Sophie and Thor. "Oh, shit. Sorry. Sorry." Captain Brooks stood, his posture shifting from sympathetic mediator to alert officer. "What's this about a threat?"
But Mac's attention had fixed on Derek, whose entire demeanor had changed, shoulders straightening, eyes sharpening with sudden focus. "It's Weaver," Mac explained rapidly. "He's at Cal's place with some of his buddies. They've got him cornered in the apartment. Cal called me from the bathroom, said they've got weapons and they're talking about teaching him a lesson for harboring a traitor, meaning you, Mitchell." The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly. Captain Brooks began issuing orders to Officer Daniels, who moved immediately to the door, hand on his radio. Derek stood rigid, his expression hardening into something that made Martha instinctively pull Sophie's wheelchair back. "This is from last night?" Derek asked Mac, his voice tight. "The argument at Sullivan's?" Mac nodded frantically. "The guy was spouting all that garbage about how you guys failed over there, how you should have saved his brother's unit. Cal told him to shut his mouth, and it almost got physical before the bartender broke it up." Derek turned to Captain Brooks. "Weaver's unstable. His brother was KIA in an operation my unit was supposed to provide backup for, but we were pinned down elsewhere. He's been blaming us for years." His eyes darted to Sophie and Martha, a decision visibly forming. "I need to go. This is my problem, not Cal's." "This is a police matter now," Captain Brooks countered. "We'll handle it." "With all due respect, Captain Weaver won't respond to cops. He's got too much hatred for authority. But he wants me." Derek's expression was resolute. "Let me go with your officers. I can talk him down." A rapid exchange followed, Captain Brooks reluctant, but acknowledging Derek's insight into the situation, Officer Daniels organizing a response team, but Mac providing details about the layout of Cal's apartment building and the number of men with Weaver. Throughout it all, Martha held tightly to Sophie's wheelchair, but acutely aware that their family interview had suddenly transformed into the staging ground for a potentially dangerous police intervention. "We should go," Martha murmured to Sophie, preparing to wheel her toward the door while everyone was distracted. But as she began to move, a startling bark from Thor froze everyone in the room. The German shepherd had risen from his position, standing with ears forward and body tense. Sophie placed a restraining hand on his back, but her eyes were wide with understanding. "Thor knows that man's scent," she announced, pointing to Mac. "He was at our cafe yesterday. Thor remembers." Derek looked sharply at Thor, then at Sophie. "What do you mean he knows his scent?" "When you were testing Thor, he was checking all the people around us," Sophie explained. "His nose was working. He does that when he's worried about a threat. He remembers people by their smell."
A moment of silence followed this pronouncement, broken by Captain Brooks' thoughtful question. "Sophie, would Thor be able to help us locate this man Weaver if he's moved from the apartment?" Service dogs typically aren't used for tracking, but given Thor's police background, Martha began to protest. Thor is Sophie's service dog, not a police resource, but was interrupted by Sophie's calm response. "Thor can find anyone if he has their scent. Daddy said he was the best tracker in the department." She looked down at the German shepherd, who remained alert but calm under her hand. "But he needs something that smells like the person." Derek exchanged a significant look with Captain Brooks. "Weaver was wearing a distinctive jacket last night, army surplus with patches, if he's still wearing it. And your friend Cal would have something of Weaver's?" Captain Brooks asked Mac. "I don't know, maybe. They got pretty close during the argument." Weaver spilled his drink on Cal's shirt. The implications rippled through the room. Thor's specialized training in search and rescue, combined with his police background, might provide a crucial advantage if Weaver and his companions abandoned Cal's apartment before the police arrived, a likely scenario given the escalating situation. Derek approached Sophie slowly, kneeling to bring himself to her eye level, the first time he had directly engaged with her since their tense encounter at the cafe. "Sophie," he said, his voice gentler than Martha had ever heard it. "Thor is your dog. He's trained to stay with you and keep you safe. But we need his help to find a dangerous man who might hurt my friend. Would you be willing to let Thor work with us just for a little while?" Sophie looked at Derek thoughtfully, then at Thor, whose attention remained fixed on the adults as if understanding the gravity of the discussion. "Thor helps people," she said simply. "That's what he was trained for." "Daddy would want him to help." Derek's expression softened, a flash of grief and gratitude crossing his weathered features. "Your dad would be very proud of you, Sophie." What happened next unfolded with dizzying rapidity. Captain Brooks, recognizing both the potential value of Thor's assistance and the impropriety of separating a child from her service dog, made a decisive judgment call. If Thor was to be deployed, Sophie would need to accompany him, but at a safe distance from any potential confrontation. Martha, despite her vehement objections, found herself outmaneuvered by Sophie's calm insistence and the urgency of the situation. Within minutes, they were moving toward the parking lot, Captain Brooks and Officer Daniels leading the way, followed by Derek and Mac, under the watchful eye of 2 additional officers, and finally Martha pushing Sophie's wheelchair, with Thor walking alertly at their side. The carefully planned interview had transformed into an impromptu operation, with Sophie's service dog potentially playing a crucial role. As they reached the police vehicles, Martha leaned down to whisper urgently in Sophie's ear, "We don't have to do this. Thor is your dog, your helper. You need him." Sophie looked up at her aunt, her young face solemn but determined. "But the man who's in trouble was Daddy's friend too. Thor can find bad people and keep everyone safe." She reached up to touch Martha's cheek with small fingers. "Don't worry, Aunt Martha. Thor always comes back to me." The convoy of police vehicles moved through Glendale with practiced efficiency, lights flashing but sirens silent, a tactical approach to avoid alerting Weaver and his companions to their imminent arrival. Martha sat in the back of a police SUV, her arm protectively around Sophie, who remained calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. Thor lay at their feet in the footwell, his body alert but steady, occasionally lifting his head to look at Sophie as if confirming she remained secure. 2 cars ahead, Derek rode with Captain Brooks and Officer Daniels, providing additional information about Weaver's background and likely mental state. The pieces of the puzzle had come together rapidly once Mac had burst into the community room Weaver. The brother of a fallen soldier, whose unit Derek's team had been unable to reach in time during a critical operation, had harbored a festering resentment for years. The chance encounter at Sullivan's bar the previous night had reignited his rage, particularly when he recognized Derek, whom he viewed as personally responsible for his brother's death. "Cal's apartment is in that complex," Officer Daniels said as they turned onto Cedar Avenue, pointing toward a two-story building of weathered brick, the third unit on the second floor, according to dispatch. Captain Brooks nodded, assessing the situation with experienced eyes. "No visible disturbance from the street. Neighbors haven't reported anything unusual." He glanced at Derek. "That could mean they've already left, or that Weaver's keeping things quiet until you show up." Derek's jaw tightened. Weaver's not the type to wait patiently. If Cal called 20 minutes ago and nothing's happened since, he left the implication hanging. They pulled into a parking space across from the apartment complex, the other police vehicles distributing themselves strategically along the block. Martha watched through the window as officers emerged. They were moving with purpose, but without obvious urgency, maintaining the appearance of routine police activity while positioning themselves for potential intervention. Captain Brooks approached their vehicle, leaning down to speak through the open window. "We're going to bring Thor forward to see if he can confirm whether Weaver is still in the building. Sophie will need you to handle him since he's trained to respond to you specifically, but you'll stay right here in the vehicle with Officer Reynolds." Sophie nodded solemnly, her small face composed despite the tension surrounding her. "Thor needs something with the man's scent. Mac's getting Cal's shirt from last night, the one Weaver spilled his drink on," Captain Brooks replied. "We'll bring it to you." Martha tightened her hold on Sophie's shoulders. "This isn't right. Sophie's been through enough trauma without being involved in a police operation." Captain Brooks' expression softened with understanding. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Anderson. If there were any other option, we wouldn't involve either of you. But time is critical, and Thor's abilities could make the difference in resolving this safely." Before Martha could respond, Mac hurried across the street, a crumpled T-shirt clutched in his hand. "Cal texted me his door code," he reported breathlessly. The shirt was right where he said it would be in his laundry basket. The shirt was brought to Sophie, who handled it with surprising composure, allowing Thor to thoroughly sniff the garment. The German shepherd's demeanor shifted immediately, his body language transforming from attentive service dog to working canine, nose actively processing information years forward with concentration. "He remembers his training," Officer Reynolds remarked from the driver's seat, watching Thor with professional appreciation. "Those skills never really leave them." Sophie stroked Thor's head gently. "He knows this is important. He can tell by how everyone's acting." Her child's perception cut to the heart of the situation with startling clarity. Captain Brooks conferred briefly with his officers, then returned to their vehicle. "We're going to do a controlled approach. Thor will work on a long lead with Sophie directing him from the vehicle. If he indicates Weaver's presence, we'll move in. If not, we'll check the apartment directly." The plan proceeded with methodical precision. Sophie was positioned at the open door of the SUV, wheelchair secured, with Thor on a 20-foot lead handled by Officer Daniels. At Sophie's quiet command, Thor seeked the German shepherd move forward with purpose, nose working systematically as he circled the ground floor of the apartment building, then ascended the exterior stairs to the second-floor walkway. Martha watched with her heart in her throat as Thor moved along the row of apartments, his body language shifting subtly as he approached Cal's unit. He paused, nose twitching, then continued past the door to the very end of the walkway, where a fire escape connected to a small landing. "He's got something," Officer Daniels reported into his radio. Not at the apartment door at the fire escape. Thor had stopped at the fire escape landing, his posture rigid with alertness, nose pointed downward toward the alley below. Officer Daniels moved cautiously to peer over the railing, then spoke rapidly into his radio, movement in the alley behind the building. 3 individuals moving toward a parked van, but one appears to be restrained. The situation escalated instantly. Captain Brooks issued rapid commands, officers moving with coordinated efficiency to surround the alley. Derek, despite instructions to remain in the police vehicle, had emerged and was moving purposefully toward the back of the building, his expression set with grim determination. "Stay here," Officer Reynolds instructed Martha and Sophie firmly. "Do not leave this vehicle under any circumstances." He secured this SUV before moving to join his colleagues, leaving them watching through the windows as the confrontation unfolded just out of sight. What happened next would later be pieced together from multiple perspectives: the officers' reports, Cal's testimony, and Derek's reluctant account. Weaver and two companions had indeed been inside Cal's apartment, but the arrival of police vehicles had prompted them to attempt a hasty escape via the fire escape, dragging Cal with them as both hostage and bait to draw Derek into a confrontation. They had nearly reached their van when the police converged on the alley, creating a volatile standoff. Cal, his face bloodied from what was later determined to be a broken nose, was held at knife point by one of Weaver's companions as, while Weaver himself brandished what appeared to be a handgun. From Mitchell, Weaver shouted, his voice carrying across the parking lot to where Martha and Sophie sat in tense silence. "I know you're here. Come face me, you coward." The officers established a perimeter, weapons drawn, but held with disciplined restraint. Captain Brooks attempted to de-escalate, his trained negotiator's voice carrying clearly, "Mr. Weaver, please put down your weapon. We can resolve this without anyone getting hurt." But Weaver was beyond reasoning, his movements erratic, his eyes wild with a combination of rage and what would later be confirmed as intoxication. "Send Mitchell out here. He's the one who needs to answer for what happened." And then, despite the officer's commands to stand down, Derek stepped into the alley, his hands raised. "I'm here, Weaver. Let Cal go. This is between you and me." Martha couldn't see what was happening, but she could hear the escalating confrontation, Derek's measured attempts to reason with Weaver, Weaver's increasingly incoherent accusations, the police officers' continued efforts to defuse the situation. Sophie sat beside her, unnaturally still, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then, without warning, Thor barked sharply and lunged against his lead with such force that Officer Daniels momentarily lost his grip. The German shepherd bolted, racing down the walkway and descending the stairs with remarkable speed. "Thor!" Sophie cried out, her composure finally breaking. "Thor, stay!" But the command came too late. Thor was already sprinting toward the alley, responding to some stimulus that only he had detected, perhaps a shift in the confrontation, a sound of distress or the scent of imminent violence that his specialized training had taught him to recognize. What followed was a cacophony of shouts, a single gunshot that echoed between the buildings, and then an eerie moment of silence before the alley erupted into frantic activity. Martha held Sophie tightly as they waited in agonizing uncertainty, unable to see what had transpired but fearing the worst. Minutes stretched like hours before Captain Brooks finally approached their vehicle, his expression grave. "The situation is under control," he reported. "Weaver and his associates are in custody. Cal's being treated by paramedics, but his injuries aren't life-threatening." "And Thor?" Sophie asked, her voice small but steady. "Where's Thor? Where's Thor?" Captain Brooks's hesitation told Martha everything before he even spoke, before he intervened when Weaver aimed his weapon at Derek. He was hit." Sophie's face drained of colour, her small body going rigid in Martha's embrace. Is he dead?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "No," Captain Brooks assured her quickly, "but he's been seriously injured. The bullet struck his shoulder. The officers are transporting him to the emergency veterinary hospital right now. Derek's with him." The world seemed to tilt beneath Martha as she struggled to process what had happened.
In the space of a single morning, they had gone from a routine police interview to a hostage situation, and now Thor, Sophie's beloved companion, her medical necessity, her most faithful friend, was fighting for his life because he had done what he was trained to do: protect. Sophie's reaction was not what Martha expected. There were no tears, no hysterics, only a quiet, terrible composure as she asked, "Can you take us to him? Thor needs me when he's scared." The drive to the veterinary hospital passed in a blur of silent prayer and gut-wrenching fear. Martha held Sophie's hand tightly, feeling the slight tremors that betrayed her niece's carefully maintained calm. Captain Brooks had arranged for them to be escorted directly, providing periodic updates from the veterinary staff who were already working on Thor when they arrived. As they pulled into the parking lot of Glendale Veterinary Emergency Center, Martha finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why did Thor run toward the danger? He's not a police dog anymore. He's supposed to stay with Sophie. Captain Brooks glanced back at him, his expression somber. According to Derek, Thor didn't attack Weaver. He positioned himself between Weaver and Derek just as Weaver raised his weapon. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Derek believes Thor recognized what was happening from his police training. He was protecting someone he perceived as part of his pack. Sophie looked up at this, her blue eyes wide, with understanding that seemed far beyond her years. "He did what Daddy would have wanted," she said quietly. "Daddy always said we protect the people we love no matter what." The waiting room of Glendale Veterinary Emergency Center was a sterile space of uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines designed for function rather than comfort. Martha sat rigidly beside Sophie's wheelchair, the minutes crawling by as they waited for news about Thor's condition. The initial report had been cautiously optimistic. The bullet had struck Thor's shoulder rather than his chest, missing vital organs but causing significant blood loss and tissue damage. The veterinary surgeon had immediately taken him into surgery, promising updates as soon as possible. Derek Mitchell sat across from them, his large frame awkwardly contained in a chair designed for people of average height. His hands were clasped between his knees, head bowed, the picture of a man consumed by guilt. He had arrived at the hospital ahead of him, having accompanied Thor in the police vehicle that served as an improvised ambulance. His leather jacket was stained with dark patches that Martha recognized with a chill as Thor's blood. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Derek said, breaking the tense silence. His voice was rough with emotion. "Thor saved my life back there. Weaver had a clear shot at my chest. If Thor hadn't jumped in—" He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Martha's response was cold, her protective instincts for Sophie overriding any sympathy she might have felt. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't harassed Sophie and Thor at the cafe yesterday. Your actions set everything in motion." Derek nodded, accepting the accusation without defense. "You're right. I was in a bad place. It would have been for a long time." He lifted his head, revealing eyes reddened from what might have been tears. "I didn't recognize Sophie yesterday. I swear I didn't. I just saw Thor and something broke inside me. Seeing him again brought everything back to Afghanistan and James, the life I used to have before everything went to hell." Sophie, who had been silent since their arrival, suddenly spoke. "You were the friend Daddy wrote to me about in his letters, the one who taught him how to train dogs." Derek's head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. "James wrote to you about me?" Sophie nodded, her small face solemn. "When he was away, he wrote me letters. Mommy would read them to me. He said his friend Derek knew more about dogs than anyone in the world and that someday he would introduce us." She paused, her young voice steady despite the weight of her words. "But then he died, and I never got to meet you." The simplicity of Sophie's statement landed like a physical blow, visibly staggering Derek. Martha watched as the realization dawned across his face. the recognition that James had valued their friendship enough to tell his daughter about him, that he had planned for them to meet under vastly different circumstances than their confrontation at the cafe.
I didn't know,
Derek whispered. After my last deployment, I cut ties with everyone. The doctors called it isolation behavior, part of the PTSD. I couldn't deal with normal life with people who hadn't seen what I'd seen. His voice cracked. James tried to reach out a few times, but I shut him out. I was angry that he seemed to have adjusted so well: police career, family, the whole American dream. Meanwhile, I couldn't sleep through the night without nightmares or hold down a job for more than a few months. A nurse entered the waiting room, momentarily interrupting the conversation. She approached them with a clipboard, requesting additional information about Thor's medical history and vaccination records. Martha provided what she could, grateful for the distraction from the heavy emotions filling the small space. After the nurse departed, promising an update from the veterinarian soon, Derek continued, his voice lower, directed primarily at Sophie. Your dad was the best man I ever knew. We met in basic training, became friends when we discovered we both loved working with dogs. In Afghanistan, we volunteered for every K9 project they had: bomb detection, search and rescue, patrol duties. Sophie leaned forward in her wheelchair, her attention completely focused on Derek's words. Daddy said Thor was special from the beginning. He was, Derek affirmed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. Just a scrawny pup when we found him, half-starved and hiding under our barracks. James started sneaking him food, and I taught him basic commands. Well, most tight. By the time our deployment ended, he was following us everywhere, already showing the intelligence that made him such an exceptional service dog. Martha watched Sophie's face as Derek spoke, seeing the hunger in her expression, the desperate need of a child to hear stories about a father taken too soon, to connect with someone who had known him in ways she never would. Despite her lingering anger at Derek, Martha couldn't deny Sophie this unexpected connection to James's past. The explosion that injured me was supposed to get both of us, Derek continued, his eyes now fixed on a point somewhere beyond the waiting room walls. We were on patrol with our unit. Thor was with us, not officially, but he'd become our unofficial mascot and rudimentary bomb detector. He alerted suddenly, started barking and trying to push us back. Derek's voice grew tight. I thought he was just being skittish. James listened to him. He always trusted Thor's instincts more than I did. The implications hung in the air between them. Martha felt her breath catch, anticipating what was coming next. James grabbed me, tried to pull me back, shouting at the unit to retreat. But I broke free, thought I knew better. Derek's hands were trembling now. The ID was buried deeper than usual. Thor sensed it, but our equipment didn't pick it up. It detonated when I was just at the edge of the kill zone. James had hung back, still trusting Thor's warning. Sophie's small voice cut through the tension. That's why you got hurt and Daddy didn't. Derek nodded, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. Your dad saved my life that day, Sophie, because he trusted a dog's instincts over human technology. When I finally got back stateside after rehab, he had already arranged for Thor to be officially trained and certified. He told me it was the least he could do to honor what Thor had tried to do for us in Afghanistan. Martha felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. All this time she had believed that James had simply found Thor through his police connections, had selected him as a K9 partner because of his exceptional abilities. She had never known that the dog had been with James in Afghanistan, had tried to warn them of the danger that had ultimately led to Derek's injuries. Why didn't James ever tell us this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek shrugged, a gesture of resignation. James protected people not just physically, but emotionally. He probably didn't want to burden you with the darker parts of his deployment. And after I pushed him away, he refused his help when I got back. Maybe he thought it was better to leave that chapter closed. The conversation might have continued in this vein.
each revelation peeling back another layer of James's past that Martha had never known, if not for the appearance of the veterinary surgeon at the waiting room door. Dr. Chen's surgical mask hung around her neck, her expression carefully neutral in the way of medical professionals delivering uncertain news. "Sophie Anderson's family?" she inquired, approaching them with measured steps. Martha and Sophie both tensed, while Derek rose from his chair, his height making him tower over the petted surgeon. "How is he?" Derek asked, the question bursting from him before Martha could speak. Dr. Chen glanced between them, quickly assessing the dynamics. "The surgery was successful," she began, directing her words primarily to Sophie. "The bullet damaged muscle tissue and cracked his scapula, the shoulder blade, but missed major blood vessels and nerves. We've repaired the damage and stabilized the fracture. He is strong and healthy, which gives him excellent odds for recovery." The collective release of tension was almost audible. Martha felt tears spring to her eyes, surprising her with their intensity. Sophie reached for her hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "When can I see him?" Sophie asked, her voice steadier than Martha's would have been. "He's in recovery now," Dr. Chen explained, still under anesthesia but responding well. "Once he's awake and stable, we'll bring you back to see him briefly." However, she continued, her expression turning serious, "Thor's recovery will require significant rehabilitation. He won't be able to perform his service dog duties for at least 8 to 12 weeks, possibly longer depending on how the healing progresses." The implications struck Martha with the force of a physical blow. Thor wasn't just Sophie's companion. He was essential to her daily functioning, helping with transfers, retrieving items beyond her reach, providing the physical support that allowed her a measure of independence despite her paralysis. Even more critically, he was trained to recognize the early signs of autonomic dysreflexia, a potentially life-threatening complication of spinal cord injuries that Sophie had experienced twice since the accident. "But I need Thor," Sophie said, giving voice to Martha's concerns. For the first time since the confrontation at the cafe, her composure cracked, her lower lip trembling slightly. "How will I manage without him?" Before Martha could respond with reassurances she didn't fully believe, Derek stepped forward, dropping to one knee beside Sophie's wheelchair to bring himself to her eye level. "Sophie, I know I'm the last person who has any right to offer help, but I trained military service dogs for years. I could help with Thor's rehabilitation, and in the meantime I could fill in for some of his duties." The offer hung in the air, as unexpected as it was complicated. Martha stared at Derek, trying to reconcile the aggressive man from the cafe with this broken soldier kneeling before her niece, offering assistance that seemed both presumptuous and desperately needed. "You would do that?" Sophie asked, her voice small but hopeful. Derek nodded, his expression grave with sincerity. "It's the least I can do. Thor took a bullet meant for me." "And your dad?" His voice faltered. "Your dad would have wanted me to step up and to finally be the friend he thought I was." Martha opened her mouth to refuse to say they would manage somehow, that they didn't need help from the very man whose actions had caused this crisis. But before she could speak, Dr. Chen interjected with gentle professionalism. "Actually, having someone with service dog training experience would be extremely beneficial for Thor's recovery. The rehabilitation process is specialized, particularly for working dogs who need to return to specific duties." She looked at Derek with new interest. "You have formal training in this area?" 4 years with the military canine program, Derek confirmed, "and I helped James with Thor's initial training before he entered the police program." This new information shifted the dynamic yet again. Martha felt her resistance wavering in the face of practical necessity. Sophie needed support that Martha couldn't provide alone, and Thor needed specialized rehabilitation beyond what a typical veterinary practice might offer. Sophie, with the directness that had characterized her approach to life since the accident, addressed the tension directly. Aunt Martha, I think Daddy would want us to accept help from his friend. She looked at Derek with those old soul eyes that had unnerved Martha from the first days of her guardianship. But you have to promise not to be scary anymore. Thor doesn't like it when people are loud and angry. The simplicity of the condition delivered with a child's straightforward logic seemed to pierce straight through Derek's defenses. He bowed his head for a moment, then met Sophie's gaze with newfound steadiness. I promise, Sophie. No more angry outbursts. I've been avoiding dealing with my problems for too long, using anger to push people away. He glanced at Martha. I've been in and out of VA treatment programs, but I never committed fully. That changes now. I get the help I need while helping you and Thor. The third revelation came as they were finally allowed to visit Thor in recovery. The German Shepherd lay on a padded table, his shoulder heavily bandaged, an IV line delivering fluids and medication. Despite the sedation, his tail thumped weakly against the table when he heard Sophie's voice, his eyes struggling to focus on her familiar form. As Sophie stroked his head with gentle fingers, whispering reassurances that seemed more suited to a parent comforting a child than a child comforting her dog, Derek stood at a respectful distance, watching the interaction with a complex expression. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly to Martha. "Something James made me promise if anything ever happened to him." He reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a folded paper that showed signs of having been carried for a long time. "Before my last deployment, when James knew I was struggling, he gave me this. He said, if I ever got my head straight, I should read it. I finally did last night after I recognized Sophie at the cafe." Martha accepted the paper with trembling fingers, unfolding it to reveal James's familiar handwriting, the same neat, precise script that had filled birthday cards and Christmas notes throughout their shared childhood. "Dear Derek," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you finally decided to rejoin the land of the living, and I couldn't be happier." 1 week after Thor's injury, the Rosewood Cafe welcomed back its youngest regular patron with a special table decorated with balloons and a hand-lettered sign reading, "Welcome back, Sophie Thor." The German Shepherd himself was not present, still recuperating at the veterinary hospital, but they said his absence was palpably felt as Martha guided Sophie's wheelchair to their usual corner table. Several patrons approached to offer well wishes, many having heard about Thor's heroism through local news coverage of the incident. "The usual?" Elaine asked, coffee pot already in hand as she greeted them with warm familiarity. "Yes, please," Martha replied, arranging napkins and utensils with the practiced efficiency of a caregiver. "And perhaps a hot chocolate for our guest when he arrives." As if summoned by her words, the cafe door opened to admit Derek Mitchell, so transformed from his previous appearance that several patrons did a double take. Gone was the intimidating leather jacket and unkempt stubble. In their place was a clean-shaven face, neatly trimmed hair, and a simple button-down shirt that lent him a surprisingly professional air. Most striking, however, was the way he carried himself, shoulders squared rather than hunched, steps measured rather than aggressive, his entire demeanor suggesting a man who had found some measure of peace. "Sorry I'm late," he said as he approached their table, a small gift bag dangling from one hand. The VA counselor had some additional resources he wanted to share. He smiled at Sophie, a genuine expression that softened his weathered features. "How are you doing, kiddo?" "I miss Thor," Sophie replied simply, accepting the gift bag with careful hands. "But Dr. Chen says I can visit him again tomorrow if his fever stays down." Derek nodded, taking the seat across from her. "That's good news. The antibiotics are working then." He watched as Sophie opened the gift bag, withdrawing a small, expertly carved wooden figure of a German Shepherd, its details capturing Thor's alert expression and dignified posture with remarkable accuracy. "Did you make this?" Sophie asked, running her fingers over the smooth wooden surface with evident delight. I did, Derek confirmed. Wood carving's been part of my therapy for a while now. Keeps my hands busy and my mind focused. He glanced at Martha, including her in the conversation. I thought Sophie might like having a version of Thor she could keep with her until the real thing comes home. Martha observed the interaction with cautious optimism. The week since Thor's injury had been filled with remarkable changes, not only in Derek, who had immersed himself in an intensive PTSD treatment program at the VA while still making time to visit Thor daily and provide updates to Sophie, but in their entire family dynamic. James's letter, which Martha had read and reread until its creases threatened to tear, had revealed a depth to her brother's friendship with Derek that she had never suspected. If something happens to me, James had written, and if Sophie ever needs more than Martha can provide alone, you're the one I'd trust, Derek. You understand service dogs better than anyone I know, and despite what you believe about yourself, you've got more heart and courage than most. Don't let what happened overseas define who you are forever. The brother I knew is still in there, and my daughter would be lucky to have you in her life. The prophecy of those words had proven uncannily accurate. In Thor's absence, Derek had stepped in to assist with the practical challenges of Sophie's daily care, accompanying them to medical appointments and helping with the specialized transfer techniques that Thor had been trained to support, and working with Sophie's physical therapist to maintain her exercise routine without her four-legged assistant. I spoke with Dr. Chin this morning, Derek said, accepting the hot chocolate Elaine placed before him. She thinks Thor might be ready for home care in another week, though his rehabilitation will take longer. I've been researching adaptive harnesses that would let him support you without putting weight on his injured shoulder. Sophie's face brightened at this news. Can we adapt his service vest too, so he can still wear it even while he's healing? Absolutely, Derek assured her. And I've been in touch with canine companions about a temporary service dog while Thor completes his recovery. They have a retired police dog named Maverick, who's already trained in mobility assistance. He could fill in for a few months without disrupting Thor's position in your life. Martha found herself continually surprised by Derek's thoroughness, his genuine commitment to ensuring Sophie's needs were met during Thor's recovery. It was as if helping them had given him a purpose that had been lacking in his life since his discharge, a way to honor his friendship with James while moving forward from the trauma that had derailed his life. The cafe door opened again, admitting Cal, his nose still bandaged from the confrontation with Weaver, but his smile genuine as he spotted them. Since the incident, he had become a regular presence in their lives as well, his steady calm providing a counterbalance to Derek's more intense energy. He approached their table, exchanging greetings before taking the fourth chair. "I've got some news," he announced, directing his words primarily to Derek. "The DA called this morning. Weaver's accepted a plea deal, aggravated assault and unlawful detention. With his prior record, he's looking at significant time." He hesitated, then added they're recommending psychological evaluation and treatment as part of his sentence. Derek nodded, his expression sobering. "Good. Weaver needs help as much as consequences." He met Cal's gaze with newfound steadiness. "We all carry scars from what happened over there. Some just run deeper than others." As the adults continued their conversation, Sophie turned her attention to the wooden carving of Thor, her fingers tracing its contours with evident affection. Martha watched her niece, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor over the past week and new confidence emerging despite the temporary loss of her service dog, but resilience that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker in the face of adversity. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Glendale Park played host to an unusual gathering. Beneath the shelter of an oak tree whose leaves had turned brilliant gold, a small crowd assembled around a picnic table specially adapted for wheelchair access.
Sophie sat at its center, flanked by Martha on one side and Derek on the other, Thor lying in perfect service position beside her wheelchair. The German Shepherd's recovery had progressed remarkably well under Derek's dedicated rehabilitation program. The specialized harness Derek had designed allowed Thor to perform most of his service duties without straining his healing shoulder, and the visible scar in his fur had become a badge of honor, evidence of his unwavering loyalty and courage. "I think that's everyone," Martha said, surveying the gathering with satisfaction. The group included many who had become part of their expanded family circle: Cal and his girlfriend Jenny, Officer Daniels, and Captain Brooks, Dr. Chen from the veterinary hospital, Sophie's physical therapist, and even Elaine from Rosewood Cafe, who had brought a specially decorated cake for the occasion. "Then I think it's time," Derek replied, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet box. He presented it to Sophie with a ceremonial flourish. "The honor should be yours." Sophie opened the box to reveal a polished service medallion engraved with Thor's name and the simple inscription, "For valor beyond duty." With Derek's help, she attached it to Thor's service vest, just above the patch that identified him as a service dog. "This is a special day," Derek announced to the gathered friends, his voice carrying the comfortable authority of a man who had found his place in the world. 6 months ago, Thor reminded us all what it means to protect those we care about, without hesitation and without counting the cost. He rested his hand lightly on Sophie's shoulder. "But what we're really celebrating today is family, not just the one we're born into, but the one we build around us when life takes unexpected turns." As if understanding the significance of the moment, Thor lifted his head, but his intelligent eyes moving between Sophie and Derek before settling on Martha with that uncanny awareness that had always been his hallmark. In that gaze, Martha saw not just the exceptional service dog who had become essential to Sophie's independence, but the living connection to her brother, a thread of continuity in a life that had been irreversibly altered by tragedy. To Thor, Captain Brooks proposed, raising his cup in a toast that was echoed around the table, and to found family. As the autumn sunlight filtered through golden leaves above them, Martha watched Derek kneeling to Sophie's level, helping her adjust Thor's harness with the patient expertise that had become his contribution to their lives. The journey from that tense confrontation at the cafe to this moment of celebration had been neither straightforward nor easy, but it had led them to a place James might have envisioned when he wrote his prescient letter, a new kind of family, forged through shared pain and healing, united by the extraordinary bond between a child and her service dog who had, in their own way, saved them all. In the quiet spaces of our later years, we often reflect on what truly matters, the bonds we forge, the challenges we overcome, and the unexpected ways we find healing. This story reminds us that sometimes our deepest wounds, whether visible, like Sophie's paralysis, or invisible, like Derek's PTSD, can become bridges to connection rather than barriers. It speaks to the wisdom that comes with age, that family isn't always defined by blood, but by those who show up when we need them most. For those of us who have experienced loss, watched loved ones struggle, or felt the weight of our own limitations, Thor's unwavering loyalty offers a powerful reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the gentle persistence of showing up day after day. As we navigate our golden years, may we recognize that it's never too late to heal old wounds, forge new connections, or become the person someone else needs us to be. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this, leave a like, and then comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.